Please be seated. Welcome to all of you. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'll mention that after Mr. Borjesson's lecture, there will be refreshments, and after a short break, there will be a question period in the junior common room directly behind me. At St. John's, we have a long tradition of mechanical malfunctions. At St. John's, we have a long tradition of not introducing our own, of not introducing lecturers who are members of our faculty or members of our college community. However, we make occasional exceptions, and it seems appropriate to do so tonight for Gary Borjesson, a tutor in Annapolis since 1999, who is visiting us in Santa Fe for the first time. Mr. Borjesson's thinking and writing seem always to have been close to or to have returned to nature, the natural world, the animal world, and the place of the human being within it. His doctoral dissertation, Actuality and Evolutionary Potential, a Study of Species, examined the ontological status of species or natural kinds in the context of evolutionary biology, drawing from Aristotle, Hegel, and contemporary natural science and philosophy. He subsequently published an essay on this theme in the Review of Metaphysics. He has also published an essay on the philosophy of Thoreau, or an argument that there is serious philosophy in Thoreau, as expressed in Walden. He has lectured at the college on, quote, wisdom's roots in nature, end quote, challenging a too quick or simple reading of the Socratic turn away from nature and to the human things. He has also lectured on the friendship of Hal and Falstaff in Shakespeare's Henry V. Then at last came his recently published book, the background for tonight's lecture, Willing Dogs and Reluctant Masters, on Friendship and Dogs. The book is an essay in the original sense, one that ties together many of the threads of his life, intellectual and personal. The book was elegantly reviewed by tutor Eva Brand in the St. John's Review. Ms. Brand concluded by saying, quote, I'll now take it on faith, the writer's faith, that dogs, domesticated wolves, may be happy under, no, may be made happy by, human mastery. But that humans, uncircumventably the masters of domesticated nature, can be exhilaratingly happy, and also better, more thoughtful, and more just in their friendly companionship with dogs. That is proven beyond doubt by this lovely book, end quote. I share Ms. Brand's judgment that it is indeed a lovely and serious book. On a personal note, I'm especially pleased to introduce and welcome our lecturer, as I have counted Gary a friend for many years. We met over 20 years ago as fellow graduate students in the philosophy department at Emory University. I was always impressed by his intellect and his articulateness, his sense of humor, and his balanced temperament. And I was delighted when he joined the faculty at St. John's. But I am most grateful for the friendship he and Cindy have extended to me over the years, and for the shining evenings of gracious and generous hospitality and conversation they have shared with me and my wife Megan at their home, often sharing also the bounty of their garden, enjoyed in the easy company of a well-trained dog. Please join me in welcoming Gary Borjesson, whose lecture this evening is titled Spirited Friends on Dogs and Friendship.
Thank you, Walter, for the very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. This is a very special evening for me, as it is my final or farewell lecture as a tutor at St. John's, which has been, as Walter said, my wonderful home for the last 15 years. So I'm very glad to be here. The Greek writer Xenophon, a contemporary of Socrates, begins his treatise Kunigetikos on hunting with dogs by naming heroes, another mechanical problem here, naming heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, Nestor, and Ajax. And then he tells us what they all had in common. Quote, "Through the heed they paid to hounds and hunting and the rest of their scholarship, they excelled greatly and were admired for their virtue. Therefore, I charge the young not to despise hunting or any other such schooling, for these are the means by which men become good in war and all things out of which must come excellence in thought and word and deed." What a pitch. If you want your children to be heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, let them learn to hunt and let them pay heed to hounds. For such schooling cultivates the virtues of citizen and soldier and friend. So tonight, I want to invite you to think about yourself and your relationships a little differently. I want to invite you to see yourself in a fresh light through the eyes of a dog. I will use our relations with dogs as a way to hold the mirror to the spirited part of our own natures, which is that part that desires friendship. The particular virtue of friends at the heart of my talk tonight is obedience. Xenophon mentions it when he says the heroes paid heed to hounds. For by obedience, I shall mean the choice to heed, to listen to mind another soul. The Latin root of obedience, obedire, means to listen to or to heed. Obedience clearly has a place in the relation of dog to master, child to parent, and student to teacher, but it's less obvious where it fits in our friendships. We don't boss our friends around, and we don't expect them to boss us. On the contrary, friendship is often a safe haven from the more authoritative and demanding relations we have with teachers, employers, colleagues, board members, and so forth. And it can be a safe haven, but I'll be arguing tonight that obedience plays an essential part in all friendships, and that issues of obedience are one of the most common source of difficulties among friends. We'll see that the real source of confusion about obedience is in fact spiritedness, that part of our nature that seeks both to dominate and to make friends. That is, the desire for mastery also underlines the desire for friends. I'll spell that out later. This part of our nature, the spirited part of our nature, has also come to be symbolized by dogs. Xenophon, for example, suggests that thumos, which is the Greek word translated by spiritedness, is a fitting name for a dog. We can see why spiritedness is confusing by observing that good friends can be playful, gentle, and loving, but also quick to anger and fierce when crossed. Like a dog, they have teeth for guarding promises. And naturally they have teeth, for those closest to us have the greatest power to help or to harm us. My talk has 3 parts. In the first part, I sketch a natural history of friendliness, focusing on how friendliness and obedience are related. Next, I'll examine friendship and spiritedness. Now, since friendships like dogs are practically minded, in the third part, I'll discuss the how of obedience training, focusing on that dramatic moment in which a master's authority is questioned, specifically in which my dog Actus disobeys openly, flagrantly, and with gusto. Actus is, by the way, another name suggested by Xenophon as being good for a dog. All right, part 1, where friends come from. Generally speaking, friendliness arose from the same evolutionary forces that gave us minds. In fact, the two are mutually developing and mutually reinforcing. This is fitting, since minding each other is what friends do. There are gradations of friendliness. Even intelligent, social, and gregarious animals like chimpanzees and wolves are no match for domesticated species when it comes to friendliness. Recent research suggests that as dogs are to their ancestor, the wolf, so are bonobos to chimpanzees, and so are we, modern humans, to our Neanderthal ancestors. What distinguishes dogs, bonobos, and humans from their close kin is that we are all self-domesticated species. Here, domesticated species have adapted in several ways that promote communication and cooperation, and hence friendliness. For example, and I have to be very brief about this, it's a very interesting subject, but beyond the purview. Domestication, in this case, selects against aggression, in part by changing the ratio of hormones like testosterone and corticosteroids in the animals that are domesticated. It also selects for advanced social cognition in the form of intention reading and so forth. The specific adaptation of dogs, their point of pride over all the animals, including the great apes, excluding ourselves, of course, is their capacity to communicate and cooperate with us. Let me emphasize that contrary to a popular opinion, human beings did not domesticate dogs. Rather, dogs domesticated themselves, emerging roughly 12 to 30,000 years ago through natural selection, not through human choice. Since dogs have domesticated themselves, we have influenced their shapes, sizes, colors, and working characteristics through selective breeding. But the basic relation of human and dog came about naturally. And on the dog side, that relation is, in fact, biologically obligatory. There are no wild dogs in nature, only feral ones. It's worth considering how remarkable an achievement friendliness is. In the dog-eat-dog world of evolutionary biology, friendliness emerged as a strategy for overcoming the natural hostility that animals have toward their own kind. Now, you may imagine that getting along with our own kind is easier than getting along with an alien species. But the opposite is true. Other animals do not share our ecological niche. Their ways of life are different enough that there is not the same competition for resources, whether food or mates or work. Thus, fear and hostility in nature are naturally directed towards one's own kind, since they pose the greatest threat to your survival and flourishing. For example, researchers studying the wolves reintroduced to Yellowstone have found that more wolves are being killed by other wolves than from any other cause. The same is true among chimpanzees, but not among dogs or bonobos. Among ourselves, even such civilized gatherings as meetings and dinner parties and question periods can be fraught with hostility. Hackles may be hidden under suits and dresses, and sharp tongues masquerade as urbane wit, but such occasions bring us to close quarters where it's natural to take each other's measures, gauge strengths and weaknesses, compete for making the better impression, and in general, to strive to gain social status and the resources that go with it. So in a way, the marvel is that we ever overcame our wariness and actually make friends. So why do we? Because cooperation is a great adaptive strategy. A wolf that hunts alone can't defend itself from attacks by other wolves and is limited to small game like mice and rabbits. But wolves in a pack can protect themselves and kill just about anything, including elk and moose. Similarly, while your behavior at a gathering may tarnish your reputation, it may also enhance it. Along the way, you may gather valuable information, meet your next business partner, the love of your life, or a lasting friend. To appreciate how empowering cooperation is, consider the African wild dogs, very feared by local inhabitants. You look at these scruffy 30, 40-pound canines, and you wonder what makes them so formidable. Sure, they have sharp teeth for gripping and tearing flesh, great noses for hunting. They're gifted long-distance runners for the chase. But really what makes them truly formidable is, ironically, their friendliness. A friendliness that means they no longer have to look warily over their shoulders at each other, but can face down common enemy or prey. So imagine being the antelope, surrounded after an exhausting chase. Two dogs face you, holding your attention while others move in from behind, tearing into your haunches. And when you turn to face them, one bites your nose and the other attack your flank. This is a terrifying image. But from the dog's point of view, it's a brilliant strategy. By turning your own former enemies into friends, you transform a competitor and threat to your own flourishing into an ally who increases your power to live and act well, which Aristotle thought was at the heart of the good that friends can do for each other. There's a beautiful illustration, most of you will be familiar with this, from the Iliad. If dogs could speak, I suspect they would reason along these lines, the lines of Diomedes. Having volunteered for the dangerous mission of going among the Trojan camp at night to spy on the preparations, Diomedes says he'd rather not go alone. Quote, "If some other man would go along with me, greater comfort would there be, and greater confidence. When two go together, one discerns before the other how to see what is best, whereas a man by himself, though he be careful, still has less mind in him than two, and his wits have less weight. In other words, friends are mind-expanding and empowering, especially when your friend is Odysseus. During their mission, the two friends come across Dolon, a Trojan spy clad in the skin of a gray wolf, Homer describes the ensuing chase thus: as when two sharp-fanged hounds, skilled in the hunt, press hard on a doe or a hare in a wooded place, even so did Diomedes and Odysseus cut Dolon off from the host and ever pursue hard after him." Unquote. And so, by the way, the old image of nature red in tooth and claw that has dominated evolutionary thinking for a long time is actually being revised. It turns out nature isn't so bloody-minded after all. Cooperation appears to be at least as powerful, or perhaps a more powerful strategy in nature than competition. And this is good news, so long as you're the dog and not the antelope, or the poor wolf-clad Dolon, whom those dogs, Odysseus and Diomedes, do finally catch and tear apart. So where does obedience fit in this story? Well, in order for animals to organize and coordinate action, in order for them to be capable of minding one another, they need to communicate. For example, in the competition for dominance among a clan of wolves, the prize is social freedom. But enhanced communication means this competition is no longer a zero-sum game. For those who submit or obey also win, inasmuch as they are still part of the social order. The competition results in a hierarchy that harnesses the power of cooperation by limiting and even sublimating the otherwise destructive tendencies of fear and hostility. Instead of fights breaking out over who gets to eat first and second and third after a kill, the mutually accepted rank order settles this matter in advance, and thus a more complex and stable civic order can emerge. Among self-domesticated species, the social network involved grows even more complex than among wolves. In the absence of such internal social pressures, the social orders in nature tend to be simpler. Researchers, for example, have observed less order in the African wild dogs than in most wolf clans. Presumably, this is because on the Serengeti, there's no space and no time to cultivate etiquette over who eats first. There are so many predators and scavengers waiting to horn in on whatever the dogs kill that the dogs fall to and eat without ceremony while they can. So here, external pressures limit the complexity of the internal social order, and that's a general principle among social animals. In the absence of external pressure, internal pressures tend to grow more and dominate and create a more complex society. So to promote social harmony, wolves spend a great deal of time communicating, developing rituals and etiquette that replace latent or overt hostility with symbolic gestures of dominance and submission that in turn reinforce the social order. Dropping the tail between the legs, turning sideways, rolling on the back and exposing belly and genitals are all ways of saying, "I obey." There are an equal number of ways of saying, "I rule." Wolves can distinguish 16 different meanings from the position of the tail alone, not to mention the eyes, ears, lips, hackle, urine, body posture, and so forth. Wolves and dogs both pay careful attention to what the others are saying through their body language. And in turn, they can become exquisitely aware of how they express themselves. and learn to exercise self-control, lest they send someone the wrong message. Paying attention, interpreting signs, reading intentions, remembering promises, judging what's fair, and adjusting behavior accordingly all require considerable brain power, which is why the largest brains are found among social animals. Social brains are other regarding by their very nature. Minds evolved in good measure for the purpose of reading other minds. For in the social world, success depends on finding out and adapting to what others are feeling and thinking. Brains themselves are highly interconnected, as are the social relations they track. Speaking of which, the heightened awareness is also directed, of course, to reading the mind of the prey. The evolutionary theorist Paul Shepard argues that the human mind, like the canine mind, came into existence through tracking and grew ever more powerful by evolving to hunt and live cooperatively. He calls our mind, quote, the child of the hunt. I think Xenophon would agree. Excuse me. Part 2, friendship and spiritedness. Friendliness is common in nature, but friendship, as I'm using the word here, is proper to animals that possess reason or have the spirited intelligence to heed it. In what follows, I'll suggest why Aristotle's claim that friends should be, quote, well disposed toward each other and wish each other's good without being unaware of this, unquote, may extend to dogs. I say may because whether dogs are actually our friends depends on the dog and on their education. Aristotle calls friendship a virtue, that is, something excellent that is achieved through practice in this case. Thus, friendship is a virtue and an art, as are carpentry, sailing, parenting, teaching, obedience training, and so on. I'll focus here on 3 main criteria of friendship. First, friendship exists only if both parties have freely chosen it. From this it follows, secondly, that friendship is an ethical relation. Finally, friendship depends on justice. These are Aristotle's claims, and ones most of us accept in practice. We deny, for instance, that someone can be our friend without our say-so. We refuse to remain friends with those who don't treat us justly. And these 2 facts, our choice and our concern with justice, suggest why it's an ethical relation, the aim of which is to promote a good and happy life. Friendships are the most free and the most profound of our relations. So are dogs ethical animals? Are they capable of choosing their friends? Are they capable of caring about justice? Are they free to choose what the terms of their promises will be? My answer to these questions is a qualified yes. Qualified. Let's consider how these questions arise with dogs and how they bear on obedience. I'll begin with a story in which, so I say, one of my dogs poses the question of justice or friendship. For I assume here, with Aristotle, that the just is the friendly. The 3 of us were standing on a little beach on Spa Creek in Annapolis. At the time, Kestra was 11 years old, a healthy 40-pound mutt who was ambivalent, unhappy, if I'm honest, about the new interloper who had shot up from being a manageable 5-pound puppy when I got him to a 90-pound-year-old German Shepherd monster. They both shared a passion for swimming, but Actus's unbridled exuberance made the excursions unpleasant for both Kestra and for me. Actus raced up and down the shore, barking with enthusiastic joy, and words like sit or stay that he comprehended elsewhere were drowned in a mad frenzy induced by water, sand, sun, and balls. When I threw a tennis ball for Kestra to swim after, Actus always either got there first or he bullied her into dropping it. He'd stolen the ball from Kestra again, and this time he had knocked her over in the bargain, and she's 11 years old and frail. Kestra stood up, she shook the sand and the water from her with characteristic dignity. She caught my eye, and you'll have to take my word for this. She gave me a look that I really understood, which said, what are you going to do about him? Since you brought this barbarian into our circle of friends, shouldn't you be doing something about him? Kester raised the question of justice from the cooperative side of spiritedness, which wants civic order and harmony and safety. Meanwhile, everything Actus did expressed the competitive side of spiritedness. Actus dominated the social and physical space, and every action expressed his glad freedom. Thus, in his own way, Actus too was raising the question of justice. It'll be familiar. Isn't justice the right of the stronger? As Callicles and Thrasymachus say, why isn't it just that being young and strong and dominant, I do as I will? His actions agreed with Callicles' view in Plato's Gorgias that the best life is one of maximum flow, a life free from all restraint. But is it just, Kester had asked, that Actus thinks only of himself and shows no regard for you or for me? At the time, Kester and I had been friends for 11 years, which means we lived partly in a world of our own making, an ethical world brought about through her education and mine, one woven of habits and promises and practices, a world into which I was now leading and actually often dragging Actus. Nietzsche said, the world was conquered through the understanding of dogs. The world exists through the understanding of dogs. Now, I take this to be a remark about the role of spiritedness, which is the understanding of dogs, in the emergence of an ethical, civilized world. Such a world emerges because, as Nietzsche suggests elsewhere, we are promise-making animals. The spirited part of our souls guards over promises, much as the alpha wolf guards over the rank order in a pack. Given their binding nature, it's no wonder that feelings associated with promises, like those associated with obedience, are complex. Often the feeling is pleasant, as when we promise to meet a friend for dinner, but sometimes it may feel like obedience, as when we promise to drive them to the airport. We call all of these bonds of friendship variously: vows, trust, keeping faith, obedience, loyalty, and love. These bonds are complicated for us, and even for Kestra, but they weren't an issue for Actus, who still lived unfettered and free in the state of nature. My task was to educate him. And again, the Latin root of education, educo, means to lead out. So I was to lead him out from his spirited, exuberant, and heedless pleasure in his own powers into a second and more cooperative nature that is more mindful of others. But how was I to do this without meddling with the integrity of his spirit? Isn't requiring Actus to obey my will incompatible with the ethical freedom of friendship? Yet if I don't train Actus, if parents and teachers don't educate children, they will be incapable of community and friendship. So cast in these terms, soul meddling is common to all genuine education. The paradox has always been that the path to freedom requires submission. It may mean submitting to a parent, a teacher, the master of an art, or even to the rules of whatever art we're practicing. Even doing simple arithmetic involves submitting to rules like the order of operations, transitivity of equality, and so on. Now, most of us recognize this fact about education, that achievement and mastery require obedience. However, this same fact often becomes a paradox when viewed through the eyes of love. Specifically, it's often hard to accept the fact that the art of friendship might require a similar discipline. Didn't I just say friendships are the freest of all our relations? I call it paradoxical as a way of pointing to our ambivalence and even contradictory opinions about this. For example, we may use our authority to persuade someone we care for to do as we want rather than as they want. A spouse insists that we change our behavior. A parent insists on bedtime. A teacher insists on obedience to certain forms. An owner insists that his dog come when he calls. Yet when you love someone and want them to love you in return, the last thing you really want to do is to require things of them that are against their will or or that somehow cause them pain. The notion of unconditional love is so popular, partly, I think, because it promises a way out of this by suggesting that true love among friends isn't conditioned by justice, and therefore needn't be darkened by the shadow of authority. In any case, the apparent incompatibility between love and authority helps explain why there's still no agreement about how to raise children, and why of the 72 million dogs in the United States, less than 4% are meaningfully obedience trained. The paradox is starkest in our unequal friendships, where one party has more authority than the other. Yet the problem extends to all friendships. Consider how that noxious word obey, as in the promise to love and obey one another, is struck from many wedding vows. My wife and I struck it from our own, in fact. We like to think that marriage is free from the shadow of authority. But when you think about it, what is love without obedience? That is, without promising to listen to each other. What greater gift can we give our friends than our complete attention? A gift that requires setting aside our will and our desires and letting ourselves be entirely moved, for a time at least, by what others say. And what complaint is more common than the one that we're not listening? And isn't it strange to insist on freedom at the very moment you're publicly avowing your promise to love and care for one another? The first step toward resolving the paradox is to consider how unequal friends like dogs are nevertheless somehow free to obey. For example, say we find ourselves resisting what we know to be good: exercise, healthy diet, study. We give ourselves a talking to, persuading the part of us that resists that it would be best to obey the part that knows better. But how easily we forget that this obedience is actually free on our part. Several years ago, I shocked students in a junior math tutorial who were grousing about a paper I'd assigned. They were saying, "Come on, do we have to?" And I replied, "Of course you don't have to." The leader of the rebellion's eyes lit up and he said, "Really?" And I said, "Really? You don't have to write the paper and you don't have to come to class. You don't have to be here at all. You're free. You've chosen all this." Another student asked, "Well, will there be consequences?" And I said, "Of course, there are always consequences." And when I said this, they assumed that I had just been putting them on the whole time and that I hadn't meant what I said. But I did mean it. We understandably resent the fact that good things like essays on Newton require effort. So part of us feels like we're doing something against our will, even though another part of us, if we recognize it, is freely choosing the work. As students or anybody in an unequal relation, it's easy to forget then how much freedom we actually have. Authorities aren't there, at least not necessarily, to tyrannize us. They're there to help, partly in some cases by supplying some of the necessary will until we're ready to be our own masters. In this context, I take it that freely obeying is often a matter of doing something we don't feel like doing, which is to say, something we're not yet persuaded, heart and mind, that is for the best for us. And so instead, we choose to trust and obey another's judgment. And being social and political animals, we're willing, by nature, to get help from others. So now with all this in mind, let's turn to spiritedness. Aristotle says, quote, that it is spirit, or thumos, that causes friendliness. For spirit is the capacity of the soul by which we love. Moreover, it is from this faculty that power to command and love of freedom are in all cases derived. For spirit is a commanding and indomitable element, unquote. Notice how the same power is friendly and loving, as well as domineering and authoritative. Spiritedness is perfectly capable of pledging obedience in one moment and striking obedience from the vows in another. In a similar vein, in the Republic, Socrates asks, "Where shall we find a character both gentle and fierce?" His companions are stumped. Even Glaucon, who's a great admirer of dogs, can't answer the riddle. And not for the first time, Socrates has to answer his own question. The dog, he says. I think one reason Socrates has to answer his own question is, again, because it's paradoxical that the same character might be both gentle and fierce. I want to make three main points about spiritedness. The first concerns what it is. I'm going to define it in terms of the gesture of self-assertion. This agrees with what we commonly mean when we call a dog or a person spirited. They put themselves forward, competing, demanding attention, seeking dominance, pushing boundaries, all for the sake of expanding territory, elevating social standing, and gaining the prizes of social freedom and respect that come with preeminence. Now, on the face of it, it's not obvious how self-assertion underlies the drive to be friendly and loving. Which brings me to the second point. The goal of self-assertion is not merely to be superior in power, but to be recognized as superior within a social context. In other words, our spirited part is thoroughly relational. It asserts itself for the sake of being recognized, honored, admired, respected, and loved. It's concerned with mastery in two related senses. First, there's mastery in the sense of social superiority, expressed in status, rank, and other marks of honor. Second, there's mastery in the sense of excelling in practices. Dogs are alive to both senses of mastery, just as we are. For in fact, these two kinds of mastery are inseparable. One cannot become socially superior merely by being powerful, a point Socrates often labors to make, and one widely reflected among social animals. Being the strongest and most fierce among a pack of wolves or a troop of chimpanzees is not enough to make you their leader, at least not for long. More often it leads to a short life and violent death at the hands of your others. The success of spiritedness depends on wielding power skillfully and proportionally, for this is what makes cooperation effective, which in turn gains the support and recognition of others, and thus distinction among your peers. The final point about spiritedness is that the desire to be recognized suggests an incipient self-awareness. The struggle over rank order in a pack can be seen as a simple attempt to locate oneself in an emergent ethical world composed of other selves. In this context, obedience signals agreement with the terms of that world and one's place in it, while disobedience disputes the justice of the social order and seeks other terms. In a recent study, researchers put several dogs together in a room. Some were given a treat when they performed a task. It was shaking the researcher's hand, while others were not given a treat when they performed the same task. And guess what? The dogs being treated unfairly immediately noticed the fact and soon refused to cooperate. This actually surprised the scientists, who concluded that dogs seemed capable of caring about justice, or as they so eloquently put it in the title of the article, the absence of reward induces inequity aversion among dogs. Similarly, when dogs compete for a stick, circle each other threatening to fight, or perform some task brilliantly and look to us for recognition and praise, they are seeking recognition of themselves and their relative status, their place in a community. How did I do? What are others getting? Am I getting my just desserts? In light of such spirited sensitivities, one can see how dogs may cultivate a sense of themselves rich enough to make what others do matter to them, and how they may come to care enough to listen and to adjust their actions accordingly, feeling pride when they succeed and shame when they fail. Note how the social order can compete with our own first instincts, their own first instincts, so that just as students might entrust their will to a teacher or institutional structure as a way to help overcome the resistance to hard but good work, so too a dog might choose to do much the same. To summarize, the spirited part of the soul exemplified in dogs is a kind of middle-mindedness, higher than the blind striving of desire and lower than fully self-possessed wisdom. When educated, the spiritedness becomes a seat of freedom and friendship. For insofar as they learn to care for the social world and promises by which it exists, dogs transcend narrow self-interest. They become heedful, that is to say, obedient, to things larger than themselves, to friends, to a quest, to an art like tracking or hunting, even to gentler virtues, such as not knocking over your friends or stealing their balls. One might speculate that the spirited drive toward cooperation is not only a source of increasing complexity from which minds emerge, but also ultimately the means by which nature comes to know herself, which is a thought both Hegel and Plato appreciate. Part 3, questioning authority. From the perspective of spiritedness, cooperative obedience may be a more promising strategy for happiness than free-spirited exuberance. I've pointed out how social animals learn this in the course of experiencing the advantages of cooperation. I want now to turn to the practical question of how we help a particular soul, in this case Actus, learn the advantages of making and keeping promises, even, alas, when it requires self-restraint. Recall that Actus's free-spirited exuberance bears a resemblance to the lack of self-restraint, that maximum flow that Callicles calls happiness in the Gorgias. Socrates replies that Callicles recommends excess only because he neglects geometry. In this final part of my talk, I want to explore the geometric moment in which the exuberant flow of spirits is given form. Specifically, this moment arises when I give my spirited friend Actus a command and thus a choice about whether to obey. I'll focus on the moment when authority is questioned. Now, no story about the relation of master and dog or master and apprentice would be complete without these moments in which the master and apprentice test one another. This is because socially minded animals instinctively grasp that there's a power and a danger in paying attention and possibly to obeying others. So when it comes to dogs and other loved ones, we have an interest in overlooking the fact that there are even tests and that we don't always want to please one another. Thus, William Kohler opens his book on dog training by saying this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Man, a bit later, created the fable that the dog, when he understands, always wants to please." Now, if this fable were true, dogs would be servile flatterers, unworthy of friendship. Instead, like Achilles in the face of Agamemnon, like the wolves in the pack, like the dogs in the study who have an inequity aversion, spirited souls perceive that their cooperation is valuable and thus will often withhold obedience from those who haven't earned their trust. So one of my tasks as Actus's would-be master is to earn his trust. Before a dog can choose whether to obey, he must first learn what we mean. This is the work of habituation or conditioning, which is not to be confused with obedience training. My distinction here is not generally recognized by dog trainers who conflate the two because they don't distinguish between the appetitive and the spirited parts of the soul. In more contemporary terms, most dog trainers are still unreformed, behaviorists, whereas the emerging cognitive approach to training acknowledges that learning takes many forms. So the conditioning approach addresses the instinctive and appetitive part of the soul. All animals, from protozoa to ourselves, learn through conditioning. It's crucial. From the start, a good master makes the world an engaging, predictable place that rewards some behaviors and discourages others. In addition to being the foundation of habits, such as not peeing in the house or pulling on the leash, good conditioning disposes a dog to regard his guide and the emerging civic order in a positive light. This is critical for gaining the dog's initial trust, for the harder work to come. By giving the impression that the world and its actors behave in orderly, proportional ways with predictable consequences, good conditioning does not neglect geometry. Conditioning teaches Actus to understand what I mean, but it doesn't assure him that I mean it. It doesn't persuade him to obey. Obedience training begins when we strike up a conversation with the spiritedly intelligent part of the dog's soul, the part capable of listening to reason. To persuade the spirited part, we need to think differently than we do when we're developing habits. Treats and other external rewards or reinforcements make sense in conditioning, but are of very dubious value once we begin appealing to a child or a dog's better nature. For example, one might use treats to establish a positive association between saying come and the behavior of coming. In obedience work, however, this association between speech and act is taken for granted. While what's at issue is their dog's attention and trust. We want the dog to come freely out of the spirit of cooperation, camaraderie, and love. If we can't expect them ultimately to come for these reasons, I don't see how we can call dogs friends in any ethical sense of that word. I don't call someone a friend who only shows up to have dinner with me if I give him 20 bucks. And so my end game with Actus will be free cooperation out of a regard for friendship. But in the meantime, there's training. So I want to return to the same beach a few months later, after we saw Actus at maximum flow. On this warm summer day, Actus was wading around in the shallows, Kestra was wading around in the shallows hunting water striders while I worked with Actus off leash. What I was doing is called finishing work by trainers. It's a late stage of obedience training because instead of restraining him with the leash, I was working him off leash. I was expecting him to exercise self-restraint in a situation he finds maximally distracting, full of what the lawyers call attractive nuisances. In this case, Kestra and water and the promise of playing at maximum flow. But despite all this, he was great, eager and cooperative, healing precisely, staying when told to, and coming promptly when called. And when it's going well, the work feels like dancing, in which there is also a leader and forms to be minded, and where the pleasure likewise is in the subtle harmony of communication and coordinated movement. After we'd worked together for about 5 minutes, a long time for Actus, I praised him, scratching his ears and telling him sotto voce what a good dog he was. Sotto voce because he's already so wound up that if I say anything very loud, he just gets more wound up. How is this praise that I'm giving him different from a treat? Unlike the biscuit, praise can be spiritual currency. I call the satisfactions of recognition spiritual because caring about one's standing and respect in the eyes of others is a social and psychic concern. When I praise Actus for healing, I'm strengthening a behavior, but more than that, I'm recognizing his choice to mind me and our practices. And in doing so, I'm reinforcing the coherence, the justice, and the power of our shared world. Thus, praise can reinforce the civic-spirited world into which dogs and humans alike are led by education. The world beyond what's built into our genes and expressed in basic instincts and drives, a world in which common visions, communication, and cooperation matter. Like pain, which Actus will bring upon himself in just a minute, praise cultivates attention. Both are most effective in stressful situations, such as finishing work provides. Since all animals, ourselves included, we learn most quickly when there's something real at stake. Just as we saw that internal social pressures will lead wolves to develop a more complex society, so as a trainer, I'm doing something analogous, generating social pressure and using pleasures and pains to cultivate Actus's attention to the increasingly complex terms of our friendship. Now, while we're naturally averse to causing pain, it turns out we should also be averse to giving praise too freely. Studies have shown that indiscriminate praise, which is rife, of course, among dog owners, parents, and educators, doesn't just diminish its power, it also does real harm, inasmuch as it distorts our charges' sense, their emerging sense of themselves and their place in the world, which in turn impedes their progress in becoming their own masters. And more generally, too much positive reinforcement results in something that psychologists call the over-justification effect, which reduces motivation for the task at hand, permanently, by the way. Let's return to the training session. When we left the scene, I was praising Actus for his good work in difficult circumstances. We began working again, but before long, Actus decided that it was more important to find out what Kestra was doing than it was to continue healing. And so he peeled off and raced down the grassy slope toward her and the water. Kestra looked up, braced herself, and gave me the stink eye. That's true. I ran after him, and when I finally caught up with him, I clipped the leash to his pinch collar and sat him roughly down before me. Excited and concerned and agitated, he tried to wriggle free. At this point, I grasped his head firmly between my hands and nipped him on the ear, triggering a loud yelp and regaining his undivided attention. I do not recommend anybody ever bite their dog on the ear. It's a good way to get yourself bitten in the face. Then I called Actus to heel and did about face, he's on leash now, heading back up the slope to continue what we were doing before we were so rudely interrupted. Now this was the dramatic moment I was talking about, when the apprentice, the dog in this case, tests by his disobedience the master's authority to mean what he says. But while this is true, I want to note that the earlier moment of his obedience was also a test. Had I failed to recognize and praise how much self-restraint and friendliness Actus was demonstrating, I'd have undermined his confidence that he and I had a shared understanding of what was at stake. Shoring up trust is crucial, again, because the dog cannot be expected to understand the deeper reasons why I'm requiring him to cooperate in such a distracting and stressful situation. Actus's disobedience and the spiritual tug-of-war it brought on has some points in common with Hegel's famous account of the struggle for recognition and freedom in the Phenomenology. In both cases, a part of what's at stake is self-knowledge, finding out where we stand with respect to someone else. And part of what's at stake is knowledge of the world. Does fire really burn when you put your hand in it? Does heal really mean heal, even on a beautiful day in the springtime of my life at maximum flow? When Kestra's getting to frolic freely? Notice, though, that both Actus's obedience and his disobedience are expressions of his freedom. Indeed, his entire experience of freedom, such as it is mediated through his social relations. So what freedom does Actus really have once he knows I'm going to correct him when he doesn't obey? In a way, that's the question my math students had once I told them that there would be consequences for not turning in a paper or coming to class. How free were they? But they only had that question for as long as they assumed what was impossible to assume, that there could be a world in which an action or inaction was inconsequential. Whether Actus still has a choice is a much harder question. Given how many times I've corrected him, it seems he does. But still, let's examine his situation in more detail. On the one hand, there's his immediate, natural, instinctive desire calling him to Kestra, or to a cat across the street. On the other hand, there is my call for his obedience. My call is also natural, in light of an evolutionary history that finds dogs and Actus open to heeding me, alive to the value of keeping promises for the sake of more life, more power, more order, more coherence, more excellence in practice. In this light, should we both happen to see a cat, I say it is perfectly natural for Actus not to chase it, should I tell him not to. It is even natural for him not to tug enthusiastically on the leash in a gesture of solidarity with all predators everywhere. It's natural the way our habits or second natures are natural, the way standing on our heads or playing the piano can become natural. It would be more natural to chase the cat only if we took a dog's drives and instincts to be the fullest expressions of their nature. But it's not their instinct to preserve themselves or their predatory drives that distinguishes dogs from any other animal. In these respects, they, and we for that matter, are indistinguishable from hungry paramecium. Rather, they're distinguished by their socially spirited natures, which seek companionship, affection, cooperation, and recognition. They are like us in their capacity to care more for what they've learned than for what's given instinctually. And in this light, friendship with us is the dog's highest distinction, And that's true from a biological and from a philosophical perspective. Actus can make a choice because his training has made the alternatives clear and meaningful in his mind. How do I know that he's choosing freely? Why not assume that Actus comes when he calls because of his conditioning, much as being in some ways a Pavlovian, a faithful Pavlovian, he reliably drools whenever I'm getting his food ready. This question actually deserves its own lecture, but for dog owners, as well as for parents and teachers, the practical concern is that obedience be free rather than slavish. So how can you tell? Now, Vicky Hearn, to whom my thinking about dogs is most indebted, made a wonderful observation that points the way. She said, "You can command a dog's obedience, but not his joy or happiness." A dog that obeys grudgingly has not given his obedience in the spirit of a friendship. Here, glad obedience expresses the dog's feeling of justice, while sullen cooperation, defiance, or outright anger expresses his feeling of injustice. And along these lines, judges in dog trials will take into account not only obedience to the forms, but also whether there is good eye contact, trust, and confidence between the master and the dog, and pleasure in the work. All of that is judged in some trials. How can we ensure glad obedience from unequal friends with whom we must, for a time at least, play the role of master? In a sentence, when you speak, say something worth hearing. For example, consider these 3 different kinds of commands. Telling a dog to sit or to stay is an inhibiting command. There's no future to it, except obedience to another soul's will. Such commands should be given sparingly, as required. In contrast, a releasing command, such as come, allows the dog to run and be with their friend. It's more worth hearing. Yet there's an even brighter and more interesting future in a command to act skillfully, such as seek. For here, a dog that has learned an art like tracking, this command sends him in to a coherent, artful world in which he's truly a master. In short, the commands most likely to keep a friend's attention are those that point beyond oneself to a world made of truths, promises, and practices, by which I mean complex actions requiring skill. In such a world, the practices are in fact the ultimate master to which both friends look for guidance. So when I command Actus to seek, what I'm really doing is invoking a word that symbolizes an art he knows and loves. Located in a world we not only share, but in which he happens to be my superior. When you watch a dog fetching or tracking or hunting or herding or guiding, you can see that the authority and the pleasure is in the arts themselves, in the practices themselves. Thus, we're well on the way to that destination towards which all good education is headed, beyond obedience and its shadow of authority, to a world in which the ultimate authorities are the practices themselves and self-mastery. Vicky Hearn observed that this world is very like paradise, that condition before the fall, when we were still glad to listen and cooperate in light of the good. I wish I could tell you that Actus and I made our home there, but he still occasionally tests our world boundaries. And though he's nearly 10 years old now, he still does it. And Kestra, she doesn't. She's been gone for 6 years. So occasionally, though, it's not just a test, I've noticed, but it's a decision to go his own way and damn the consequences. And as often as not, I end up agreeing with him as he's gotten older, which is just to say that sometimes he shows better judgment than I do about the circumstances. And I think this is common among friends and friendships once they're established. In any event, Actus rarely fails me when I'm giving him my faithful attention. Thus, the key to getting obedience is much the same as the key to good friendships. Keep it captivating. What are friends for? A friend of mine has said, to enchant one another. In Aristotle's terms, to amplify our happiness by extending our ability to think and to act. In the terms of evolutionary psychology, the answer is much the same. Through cooperation, to expand our minds, enhance our power, and better our lives. I'll let Plato have the last word here, since I have him to thank for helping make philosophical speeches about dogs a little respectable. There's a point in the Gorgias where Callicles exhorts Socrates, in the name of friendship no less, to obey him and set aside his childish ways. Socrates replies that it looks like Callicles has the three things necessary if one soul is to test another soul about their way of life: knowledge, kind regard, and frankness. I think Socrates is being ironic here. I think Callicles probably has one of those. That's an excellent summary, though, of what we hope for from our friends in the moment when they've asked us to heed them. For our part, we can rise to the occasion by our eagerness not only to consider another view, but also, as Socrates again puts it, by our eagerness to be refuted, to obey another's judgment, after we've tested it, of course. This eagerness is vital to the philosopher's hunt for truth, but it is equally vital to all arts, including friendship. Cosmically speaking, the virtue that binds friends, minding one another, minding our promises, heeding the logos, also appears to bind the world itself. As Socrates puts it, quote, "Wise men say, Callicles, that heaven and earth and gods and men are bound together by communion and friendship, orderliness, temperance, and justice, and it is for that reason they call this whole a cosmos, and not, my friend, intemperate disorder." Thank you.